There you go, CC. There you go, Caitlin. Way to hold it down, Caitlin Clark. Caitlin Clark told the WNBA, damn you and your bogus orange carpet. I ain't showing up to nothing. I'm not showing up to your bogus orange carpet. I'm not showing up to this joke of a three-point shootout. I'm not showing up to link up and kick it with none of y'all. Y'all fake, y'all phony, y'all jealous, y'all are haters. Caitlin Clark just pulled a no-show for...
Picture this. It's the summer of 2026, and the WNBA is standing at the absolute top of the mountain. Years of grinding, years of fighting for legitimacy, years of begging mainstream sports media to take women's basketball seriously, and finally, it all appeared to be paying off in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. The 2026 All-Star Weekend in Chicago wasn't just another event on the calendar. It was being marketed internally and externally as the single greatest moment in the entire history of women's professional basketball. The arena was sold out months before the first ticket was even scanned. The secondary market was completely on fire, with courtside passes reportedly fetching prices that would make your jaw hit the floor. Major broadcast networks had staked their entire summer programming strategy on this one weekend, delivering record-shattering viewership numbers. Corporate sponsors were lined up around the block, throwing obscene amounts of money at the league for a piece of the action. Everything, and we mean absolutely everything, was pointing toward one direction: straight up. And then, in the span of less than 48 hours, it all came crashing violently back down to earth. Right now, if you were standing inside the WNBA league offices, what you would witness is nothing short of complete and total organizational meltdown. Sources familiar with the situation describe scenes of genuine panic, with executives scrambling between emergency phone calls, sponsors demanding urgent answers, and broadcast partners reportedly threatening legal action. The kind of chaos that doesn't just damage a league's reputation for a single weekend, it leaves scars that take years to heal. Millions of dollars reportedly bleeding out by the hour. Advertising campaigns worth fortunes being yanked off the air in real time. And if the whispers coming out of the NBA offices are to be believed, Adam Silver himself is allegedly furious, not just disappointed, not just concerned, but genuinely deeply furious at the sheer scale of incompetence on display. So what on earth actually happened? How does the most anticipated weekend in women's basketball history transform into a five-alarm financial disaster almost overnight? The answer is both simpler and more shocking than you might expect, because according to multiple sources close to the situation, the WNBA front office didn't just make a mistake, they reportedly made the single most arrogant, most politically motivated, and most financially catastrophic decision in the league's entire existence. They tried to put a leash on Caitlin Clark, and they picked absolutely the wrong person to try that with. But to truly understand the full magnitude of what reportedly went down, we can't just start at the explosion. We have to go back and look at exactly how the fuse got lit in the first place. Because this story didn't begin 48 hours before All-Star Weekend. It's been building quietly, bitterly, and dangerously for a very long time. The WNBA has always had its internal politics. Every professional sports league does. There are hierarchies, there are egos, there are veteran players who have dedicated their entire careers to the sport and feel deeply entitled to the spotlight they spent years earning. That's understandable. That's human nature. But what allegedly began happening behind closed doors over the past few months represents something far darker than standard locker room politics. According to sources with knowledge of internal league discussions, a quiet but deeply coordinated resentment campaign had been building among a faction of veteran players and certain front office traditionalists, all of it aimed squarely at one person: Caitlin Clark. Now, to be absolutely clear, none of what we're about to detail has been officially confirmed by the league or by any named individuals, but multiple independent sources, including people present in private conversations, have been consistent in describing the same general picture, and that picture is deeply unsettling. The core of the alleged resentment, according to these sources, was straightforward. Caitlin Clark was making everyone else invisible. Not intentionally, not maliciously, simply by being so extraordinarily talented, so magnetically watchable, and so commercially valuable that everything and everyone around her naturally faded into the background whenever she stepped onto the floor.
Time, we'll place the call to Caitlin Clark to get whatever it is you need. Take a look at this. Shout out to Correlation. Correlation said, bruh, Caitlin is in Iowa and StubBud was just asking where she is. Caitlin Clark pulled a no-show. Caitlin Clark's out in Iowa, having a good old time, not dealing with this nonsense, going to see, you know, hair people and all of this stuff. She ain't got time to be dealing with these people no more. And I don't blame her. If I was Caitlin Clark, I would.
Fans weren't buying tickets to see the WNBA. They were buying tickets to see Caitlin Clark. Sponsors weren't writing massive checks because they believed in the league's broader mission. They were writing those checks because Caitlin Clark's name was on the marquee. Television networks weren't scheduling primetime broadcasts out of some long-standing loyalty to women's basketball. They were scheduling them because Caitlin Clark guaranteed eyeballs. And for a certain group of veteran players who had sacrificed enormously for this league long before Clark ever arrived, who had played through low salaries, near-empty arenas, and years of public indifference, that reality reportedly stung in a way that was genuinely difficult to process. Instead of channeling that frustration productively, sources suggest that certain voices within the league began pushing for something far more destructive. The idea, reportedly floated in private conversations and eventually escalating to formal back-channel discussions with league officials, was simple in concept but devastating in potential consequence. Find a way to limit Clark's dominance of the All-Star stage, force her to share the spotlight, make the weekend feel like a true ensemble event rather than the Caitlin Clark show. On the surface, when you strip away all the context, that idea might almost sound reasonable. But the way it was allegedly pursued, the method chosen, the timing selected, and the total disregard for the commercial consequences is what turns this from a questionable internal policy debate into something that reportedly lit the entire building on fire. And what makes this all the more remarkable is that the people making these decisions reportedly did so with full knowledge of exactly how much the league's financial health depended on Clark's participation. They knew, and according to sources, they moved forward anyway. That level of institutional arrogance is genuinely staggering to contemplate. Here's where the story takes a turn that even the most dramatic sports fiction writers would struggle to manufacture. According to sources with reported knowledge of internal league communications, approximately 48 hours before the All-Star Weekend tip-off in Chicago, a highly restricted closed-door meeting was convened between senior WNBA league officials and representatives connected to the Indiana Fever organization. The purpose of this meeting, per these sources, was not to celebrate the upcoming showcase event. It was not to finalize logistics or run through broadcast schedules. It was, reportedly, to deliver a directive that had allegedly been building in the background for weeks. Caitlin Clark's playing time at the All-Star game needed to be aggressively managed. The specific parameters of what was allegedly proposed vary slightly depending on which source you consult, but the consistent through line is this. Clark would reportedly be restricted to a carefully limited number of minutes, concentrated in select quarters, with the remainder of the game's broadcast time being redistributed to ensure other players received significantly more camera time and floor time. The official framing that was allegedly prepared for public consumption, should this restriction ever become known, was the now familiar sports industry cover story of load management, protecting her long-term health, being responsible stewards of their star players' physical well-being going into the second half of the season. But sources who claim to have knowledge of the actual conversations inside that meeting describe a very different motivation. According to these accounts, health had essentially nothing to do with it. The restriction was allegedly a politically motivated attempt to artificially level the playing field during a nationally televised showcase event,
to prevent Clark from doing what she naturally does, which is completely and utterly dominate every moment she's on the floor, and to create manufactured space for veteran players to reclaim some of the spotlight they felt they'd been systematically robbed of since Clark entered the league.
Now, reasonable people can absolutely debate whether veteran players had legitimate grievances about recognition and spotlight distribution. That is a genuinely complex conversation worth having. But what is not debatable, assuming these reports are accurate, is the method allegedly chosen to address those grievances. Because if the accounts circulating among sources close to the situation are to be believed, what the league allegedly did next was invite Caitlin Clark herself into a private meeting, slide a document containing the proposed minutes restriction across the table, and expect her to simply nod her head, pick up a pen, and sign off on her own deliberate marginalization at the single biggest event of the WNBA calendar year. They reportedly expected compliance. They reportedly expected deference. They reportedly expected that even a player of Clark's stature would ultimately bow to institutional authority and accept the terms placed in front of her. If that's true, it represents a miscalculation so profound, so catastrophically out of touch with the reality of who Caitlin Clark is and what she represents, that it almost defies belief. Because what allegedly happened next didn't just surprise the executives in that room, it reportedly sent shockwaves through the entire professional sports world. Nobody who has followed Caitlin Clark's career even casually should be surprised by what reportedly came next. This is a player who was draining logo threes before logo threes were fashionable. This is someone who built an entire college basketball revolution on the back of an absolutely fearless, completely unintimidated competitive mentality. She didn't become the most commercially valuable player in women's basketball history by backing down from pressure. She got there by thriving under it, by leaning into it, by converting it into fuel. So when sources report that she was presented with a mandated minutes restriction designed to limit her impact at the All-Star game, what happened allegedly wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't a polite back and forth. It was, reportedly, an immediate, unambiguous, and completely non-negotiable rejection. According to accounts from sources claiming to have knowledge of what transpired, Clark did not raise her voice, she did not make a scene inside the meeting room, but she reportedly made her position crystal clear in the most direct terms possible. She was not going to accept an artificially imposed minutes restriction on her playing time at an All-Star event. She was not going to allow her participation to be surgically managed for the political benefit of other parties. And if the league intended to move forward with this plan, then the league was going to have to find out exactly what the All-Star weekend looked like without her. According to these sources, she gave them a choice. Remove the restriction entirely and publicly, or lose her presence at the event completely. Then, reportedly, she stood up and walked out. What allegedly followed in the hours after that meeting represents one of the most dramatic sequences of events in recent women's sports history, at least according to the sources describing it. Clark reportedly shut down direct communications with league officials. She allegedly did not board the chartered team flight to Chicago. She reportedly was a no-show for the mandatory media availability that All-Star participants are expected to attend. The red carpet event, one of the most highly publicized pre-game spectacles of the entire weekend, went forward without her. And perhaps most consequentially, her name was reportedly formally withdrawn from the All-Star roster itself. The boycott, if that is the accurate term for what sources describe, was apparently total. There was no half measure, no carefully worded statement about taking time to evaluate her options, no public relations softening of the message. If the accounts are accurate, Clark's position was communicated through pure, unambiguous action. She was either going to be allowed to participate fully and freely, or she was not going to participate at all.
and for a certain period of time, according to these sources, the WNBA front office reportedly convinced itself that this was a negotiating posture, a dramatic gesture designed to force concessions before she ultimately relented and showed up. They allegedly held that belief right up until the moment the chartered flight doors closed and she genuinely was not on it. That's when, by all accounts from sources familiar with the situation, the real panic began.
The financial consequences of what reportedly unfolded next are almost difficult to fully comprehend in their speed and their severity. Within hours of news beginning to circulate, initially through social media chatter and then through more formal reporting channels, that Caitlin Clark was not going to be appearing at the All-Star game due to a dispute with the league over her playing time, the economic damage allegedly began cascading in real time at a pace that reportedly left league officials genuinely stunned. The secondary ticket market, which had been one of the most impressive indicators of the event's commercial power, apparently went into freefall almost immediately. Seats that had been commanding prices in the thousands of dollars, VIP courtside packages reportedly fetching figures north of $5,000 in some cases, began collapsing in value within the span of a single hour. Buyers who had secured premium tickets at premium prices were flooding resale platforms, demanding refunds. Sellers who had been sitting on inventory, expecting to profit, were now reportedly unable to move tickets at any meaningful price point. The demand that had made this event look like an unprecedented commercial triumph had been, it turned out, almost entirely driven by one specific player's anticipated presence. Remove that player, and the demand apparently evaporated almost instantly. But the ticket market was, in some ways, the least of the league's reported problems. The far more serious financial damage was allegedly coming from two directions simultaneously. First, the broadcast partners, networks that had aggressively invested in securing the rights to this event and had built their entire summer sports programming strategy around the guaranteed viewership that Caitlin Clark's participation was supposed to deliver, were reportedly making furious phone calls to league leadership within hours. The language being used in those calls, according to sources with knowledge of the conversations, was not the polite corporate language of concern and inquiry. It was reportedly the language of legal threat, breach of contract discussions, demands for financial compensation, the suggestion that networks had paid for a specific product and were not going to quietly absorb the financial loss that came with having that product pulled out from under them at the last moment. Second, and arguably even more damaging to the league's long-term commercial health, were the sponsors. The major corporate partners whose logo placements, advertising campaigns, and brand activations had been specifically structured around Caitlin Clark's presence and performance were reportedly making their own calls, and those calls were carrying an equally serious message. The financial arrangements that had been made were predicated on Clark being at the event, performing at the event, and generating the media attention and social engagement that Clark specifically, not the WNBA generally, was uniquely capable of generating. Without her, those arrangements were apparently on very shaky ground. Multiple sponsors were reportedly threatening to pull their campaigns entirely, with some allegedly going further and suggesting that the events of this weekend would fundamentally reshape their appetite for future investment in the league. We are talking, according to various sources familiar with the financial picture, about a potential loss running into the tens of millions of dollars. Not over a season, not over a year, over a single weekend. The speed and the totality of the financial collapse reportedly stunned even the people who had been warning internally that restricting Clark carried serious commercial risks, because even the pessimists apparently hadn't anticipated it happening this fast or this completely. While the financial avalanche was reportedly burying the league offices under an increasingly desperate pile of sponsor calls, legal threats, and collapsing ticket valuations, something equally significant was allegedly playing out in a very different setting.
because the veteran players, who according to sources had been among the loudest voices pushing for Clark's minutes restriction in the first place, were now reportedly getting a front-row seat to the consequences of what they had allegedly advocated for.
And those consequences were, by all accounts, brutal. The media attention that All-Star Weekend is supposed to generate, the cameras, the feature segments, the social media buzz, the cultural moment that makes the event matter beyond just the basketball itself, apparently did not materialize in anything close to the expected volume. Because the uncomfortable truth, the one that nobody in the league's veteran establishment apparently wanted to confront directly, was now being demonstrated in the most painfully public way imaginable. The cameras that were supposed to be capturing the drama and the excitement of the league's showcase event were instead focused almost entirely on one story. And that story wasn't about basketball. It was about where Caitlin Clark was, why she wasn't there, and who was responsible for the situation. The veterans who had reportedly wanted the spotlight had the spotlight, and the spotlight, it turned out, was not a flattering one. Instead of celebrating their performances and their achievements, the national conversation was consumed by the question of whether internal jealousy had just caused the league to self-destruct its biggest event of the year. The names being mentioned most frequently in that conversation were not being mentioned in the context of athletic excellence. They were being mentioned in the context of alleged political maneuvering that had backfired catastrophically. Social media, which had been an engine of excitement and anticipation in the weeks leading up to the event, had apparently flipped entirely. Fans who had been counting down to the weekend were now expressing a mixture of fury, disappointment, and something perhaps even more damaging to the league's long-term health: complete indifference. People who had been excited about the WNBA's biggest weekend were now reportedly not watching. Not because they were protesting, simply because the thing they had specifically wanted to see was no longer available, and without it, the event apparently held very limited appeal. That is perhaps the most devastating indictment possible of the decision that was allegedly made. Not that it made people angry. Anger at least implies investment and engagement. The real damage was that it apparently made a significant portion of the audience simply stop caring, at least for this particular weekend. The Indiana Fever front office, which had reportedly been party to the initial meetings where the restriction was discussed, allegedly went from feeling like a powerful institutional actor navigating a complex political situation to being on the receiving end of a fan backlash that was reportedly severe, sustained, and deeply personal. Fever supporters, who by this point had developed an almost fierce loyalty to Clark specifically, were allegedly expressing their anger in very direct terms. And the broader national sports audience, including fans who had only recently discovered women's basketball through Clark's arrival in the league, were reportedly receiving a masterclass in exactly why institutional sports politics so often drives casual fans away permanently. By the time the full scale of the catastrophe was becoming undeniable, sources suggest the WNBA front office had moved through the stages of denial and anger and arrived rapidly and somewhat desperately at bargaining. The same executives who had allegedly authorized the minutes restriction as a reasonable and manageable internal policy decision were now reportedly making urgent outreach in the opposite direction entirely. The restriction, sources suggest, was no longer on the table. It was reportedly being described internally as a misunderstanding, a communication failure, something that had never been intended to create this level of disruption. Whether that framing reflected genuine reflection or a simply pragmatic damage control is perhaps a question that only the people in those rooms can honestly answer. What sources describe happening externally is that the league was in effect reportedly making a public retreat. The position that had been taken 2 days earlier, that Clark's playing time would be managed for health and competitive balance reasons, was apparently being quietly abandoned. Assurances were reportedly being communicated that she would have full freedom to play without restriction if she chose to participate. The offer, if sources are to be believed, was essentially unconditional. Come back. Play on your terms. We will not impose limitations. The financial pressure had apparently been severe enough and swift enough to override whatever political calculations had driven the original decision. But here is where the story reaches what might be its most significant turning point. Because even if Clark had chosen to return, and the timeline of events makes the feasibility of that increasingly complicated given how much of the weekend's programming had already proceeded without her, the fundamental damage to the event was reportedly already done. The ticket buyers who had demanded refunds had received them or were in the process of receiving them. The sponsors who had made threatening phone calls were not going to simply forget those conversations because the situation was partially resolved at the last hour. The broadcast partners who had built their programming around guaranteed viewership were watching those viewership numbers in real time and reportedly absorbing losses that no amount of late-stage course correction was going to fully recoup. And perhaps most significantly of all, the story that was now permanently attached to the 2026 WNBA All-Star Weekend was not the story of a triumphant, record-breaking showcase event. It was the story of institutional miscalculation, alleged political jealousy, and a boycott that proved beyond any reasonable argument that one player had become more financially essential to the league than the league itself was comfortable admitting. That story was not going to be walked back by any press release or any last-minute negotiation. It was already written, it was already being broadcast, and it was going to follow the league for a very long time. Step back from the immediate drama for a moment and look at what this situation, as reported through various sources and reflected in the public reaction, actually reveals about the state of the WNBA and its relationship with its own biggest star. Because there is a deeper story here than a single boycott over a single event. And understanding that deeper story matters a great deal for anyone trying to make sense of where women's basketball goes from this point forward. The WNBA's explosion in commercial relevance over the past 2 years is not a complicated story to tell. The numbers tell it plainly. Attendance records broken, broadcast viewership at historic highs, sponsorship deals signed at values the league had never previously approached, merchandise sales generating revenue streams that would have seemed fantastical just a few years ago, social media engagement numbers that position the league as one of the fastest-growing sports properties in the entire country. All of it, every single piece of it, has been fundamentally intertwined with one athlete's arrival and ascent. That athlete is Caitlin Clark. Now, that reality is genuinely complicated for a league that wants to be about more than one player. A healthy, sustainable sports league ideally has multiple stars, multiple narratives, multiple reasons for fans to invest emotionally and financially. The WNBA has many extraordinarily talented players. It has athletes who deserve significantly more recognition and commercial attention than they currently receive. The desire to build a league that doesn't depend on a single person's presence for its commercial viability is not just understandable, it's genuinely the right long-term goal. But here is where the alleged decision-making reportedly went so catastrophically wrong. The way to build that broader foundation is not to artificially restrict the player who is currently generating the financial oxygen that allows the entire ecosystem to breathe. The way to elevate other players is not to diminish the one who is currently driving growth. What was allegedly attempted, capping Clark's participation in order to redistribute spotlight to veterans who felt overshadowed, reportedly didn't elevate anyone. It just reportedly collapsed the entire event. It didn't create new stars. It just reportedly extinguished the existing light source and left everyone standing in the dark. The lesson that the league is apparently being forced to absorb right now, through the most painful and public possible method, is that Caitlin Clark's value to the WNBA is not replaceable in any meaningful short-term time frame. She is not just a talented player in a talented league. She is, at this specific moment in the sport's history, the primary engine of the league's commercial relevance. Trying to manage that reality through restriction rather than through celebration has reportedly proven to be one of the most self-defeating strategic decisions in recent sports history. And the players, executives, and institutional forces who allegedly pushed for that approach are now reportedly confronting the full weight of its consequences. Here's what makes this entire situation so genuinely unprecedented in the world of professional women's sports.
Athletes have leverage. Stars push back against management decisions. Contract disputes happen. Boycotts have occurred. None of that is new. But what is reportedly playing out here goes beyond a standard athlete versus league power struggle, because the scale of the financial consequences that allegedly followed Clark's reported withdrawal from the event is simply unlike anything we have seen in this specific context before. When a star player in a major men's sports league misses a game or an event due to a dispute, the league absorbs the hit. The product continues, the broadcast goes on, the audience shows up, maybe somewhat diminished but present. The infrastructure is robust enough to handle the absence of any single player without collapsing commercially. What the 2026 WNBA All-Star Weekend is reportedly demonstrating is that the Women's League, at least at this moment in its development, does not yet have that kind of structural resilience. The commercial foundation is strong, but it is reportedly, based on what happened when Clark stepped away, built on a somewhat narrow base, and that base has a name. That reality carries implications that extend far beyond this specific incident. It raises serious questions about the league's negotiating position in its relationship with Clark going forward. If the reported financial fallout from a single weekend boycott is as severe as sources suggest, what does that mean for the league's ability to make any future decisions that Clark finds objectionable? It potentially shifts the power dynamic in ways that are going to be very difficult for institutional leadership to navigate comfortably. Athletes in this position, where their commercial value to the institution genuinely exceeds the institution's leverage over them, tend to accumulate influence in ways that reshape how leagues operate at a fundamental level. There are also broader questions about what this moment means for other players in the league. Does the reported success of Clark's alleged stand create a template that other players might attempt to use? Does it change the calculus around collective bargaining and individual player leverage? Does it accelerate or complicate conversations about how WNBA salaries and revenue sharing should be structured? These are not questions with simple answers, but they are questions that the events of this weekend, as described by sources familiar with the situation, have reportedly forced onto the table in ways that can't be easily dismissed or quietly tabled for later.
And then there is the question of Caitlin Clark herself, and what comes next for her relationship with the league she has reportedly just demonstrated she can bring to its financial knees with a single decision. Sources suggest the WNBA is going to emerge from this weekend in a fundamentally altered negotiating position relative to its biggest star. Whether that shifts into open conflict, into a renegotiated and more equitable partnership, or into some more complicated ongoing tension is something that only time is going to reveal. But the power map has reportedly been redrawn, dramatically, publicly, and at enormous financial cost. The most interesting question to sit with as this story continues to develop isn't really about ticket prices or broadcast ratings or sponsor dollars, as significant as all of those things clearly are. The most interesting question is about what the WNBA actually wants to be, and whether the people currently running it are capable of making the institutional adaptations necessary to build on the extraordinary moment they are currently living through, rather than fighting against it. Because here is the reality that no amount of internal politics can change. The WNBA is experiencing a golden era of public attention and commercial opportunity. There are more eyes on women's basketball right now than at any other point in the sport's professional history in this country. There are more sponsors willing to invest, more broadcasters willing to pay for rights, more casual sports fans willing to give the product a genuine chance. That is an extraordinary foundation to build from. And the overwhelming majority of that opportunity exists, at least in significant part, because of one player's extraordinary impact on the league's cultural footprint. Managing that reality wisely, celebrating it, leveraging it,
Using the financial oxygen it generates to build something more durable and more broadly supported is the challenge in front of the league's leadership. What was allegedly attempted this weekend, if the reports are accurate, was the opposite of wise management. It was reportedly an attempt to suppress the phenomenon rather than channel it, and the reported results speak for themselves in numbers that no executive is going to be able to spin positively, regardless of how creatively they try. Caitlin Clark reportedly walked out of a meeting, declined to board a plane, and allegedly watched from Iowa while the league's most important event reportedly struggled commercially in her absence. Whether you think her reported response was justified or excessive, whether you believe every detail of the accounts circulating through sources, or you're skeptical of the narrative that's formed, the financial reality that reportedly followed cannot be argued with. The golden goose, as one colorful description has it, went rogue, and the people who allegedly tried to clip her wings are now apparently sitting in the wreckage of the cage they built, wondering how they got here. The WNBA will survive this, that much seems clear. The league is stronger than a single weekend, however damaging that weekend has reportedly been. But what it reportedly cannot survive, not indefinitely, not without serious institutional cost, is a continued pattern of making decisions that prioritize internal political appeasement over the commercial and cultural realities of where the league currently stands. The fans have spoken, loudly and financially. The broadcast partners have spoken, reportedly through their lawyers. The sponsors have spoken, reportedly through withdrawal threats that carry serious long-term implications. The only question that actually matters now is whether anyone inside the WNBA's front office is genuinely listening.
So here we are. A league that was supposed to be celebrating its greatest triumph is instead reportedly doing emergency financial triage. A group of veteran players who allegedly pushed for a political win are now living with the public narrative that their actions helped burn down the house. A front office that reportedly tried to cage the sport's biggest attraction is apparently scrambling to offer unconditional terms it could have offered 2 days ago and avoided all of this entirely. And one player, reportedly back in Iowa while the chaos allegedly unfolds without her, has apparently made her point in the most undeniable terms imaginable. Whether every detail of this story plays out exactly as sources describe, whether the full truth of what happened in those private meetings ever becomes publicly verifiable, and whether the long-term consequences are as severe as the immediate picture suggests, all of that remains to be seen. What is not in question is that the events of this weekend have sparked one of the most significant conversations in the recent history of women's professional sports. A conversation about power, about value, about institutional politics, and about what happens when a league tries to manage a phenomenon rather than embrace it. The question we want to leave you with is this: was Caitlin Clark right to draw the line where she reportedly drew it? Was a total boycott the appropriate response to what sources describe, or should she have shown up, played under protest, and fought the battle through other means? And what does it say about the state of the WNBA that reportedly one player's absence was enough to reportedly send the entire financial structure of its biggest event into freefall? Drop your unfiltered take in the comments right now. This is genuinely one of those stories where the public reaction matters because the league is absolutely watching what fans think. If you want to stay on top of every development as this situation continues to unfold, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this story, based on everything sources are currently describing, is nowhere close to being over.